Welcome to the business podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. AmCham business podcasts are hosted by Dr. Duff Watkins. Duff is a director of Exec Search International, an author, and is also on the AmCham Council of Governors. AmCham, bringing business to you.
You're listening to the business podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce, and today we address scientific decision-making by management. Is such a thing even possible? My name is Duff Watkins. I'm your host of the AmCham Business Podcast, and today our guest is Don Peppers. The word thought leader is bandied about rather liberally, but Don actually is one. He's widely credited with having launched the customer relationship management revolution. He's been described by Accenture as one of the top 100 business intellectuals. The Times of London says he's one of the top 50 business brains. He's in the Hall of Fame of the Direct Marketing Association in the U.S. He's written a heap of books, sold 1 million copies in 18 languages, but most importantly, he's with us here today. How are you, Don?
Good, Duff. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for being on the show. Now, Don, you say that managers should make more scientific decisions. Oh, this is just music to my ears. But what do you mean by scientific decisions?
Well, we're surrounded by all this plethora of data now. We have so much data, but management's decision-making process and tools, they really haven't improved much. People still make a lot of intuition or judgment-based decisions when there actually is evidence they should pay more attention to. And there's evidence for lots and lots of different kinds of decision-making that goes on where the evidence is ignored. And bad decisions are everywhere. There was one study of railroad projects over the last 30 years. 90% of them overestimated passenger traffic, and the average overestimate was over 100%. All of them had cost overruns. The average overrun in cost was 50%. Now, despite the fact that those figures were widely publicized, the projects never got any better estimated. They never get better. No.
It reminds me of that book, Mistakes Were Made, but not by me. The study of why people make bad decisions and cling to them.
Yes.
And management is a spectacular example of that. Okay, well, what characterizes a scientific decision?
Well, I think you could think of evidence-based management somewhat like evidence-based medicine. Doctors are told these days to rely on data. Now, in order to do that properly, they have to ignore common wisdom, well thought of homonyms and so forth, and they have to pay close attention to the data, and they got to try not to form a judgment before they look at the data. That's the most important thing. Look at the data first. Try to resist making a judgment on your intuition or your experience even before you actually pay attention to the data. You look at the data first, and then you try to form an opinion. And that's called evidence-based management, is what I would call it.
Well, why is that so difficult for people? I mean, it seems bleeding common sense.
Yeah, we're all very intelligent animals, but we're intelligent, and we also have instincts. And those instincts have stood us very well through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, and we come to them naturally. Some biologists think that the facility of speech evolved primarily to allow people to persuade others to do what they wanted them to do, to have social power. And the facility of even intelligent reasoning and planning ahead evolved for the same reason. So it's natural that when you have your mind made up on something, you look for evidence that confirms that. That's the confirmation bias. You ignore evidence that undermines your thesis, when in fact the scientific method is always to look for disconfirming data. Let me give you an example of how this plays out. How many times have you read a management book by some business guru talking about all the best practices of some companies, okay? But mostly, those business books suffer greatly from biased data. I'll give you an example. Suppose a management guru said, here are 10 cases of businesses that succeeded wildly. What do they have in common? What are their best practices? Well, in each case, the management focused on a particular strategy, and they realized it was revolutionary. It threatened their business, but they went all in. They didn't look back, and they succeeded. So that's what you should do.
All
What
in
did-
in order to
All
succeed.
in, yeah.
Got it.
But
Okay.
what they didn't tell you is that those 10 companies succeeded, but there were 100 other companies that went all in and failed. See, studying best practices doesn't get you much. Instead of studying best practices, what you really need to study is all practices.
practices.
You need to know what the worst practices are too. You need to know what you need to know. You need to draw from the universe of examples, not from a selected group.
You use the example of medicine. They call it the number needed to treat. You have to look at all the people that they needed to get the treatment effect. Like, for example, insulin is perfect. You need one person, give them insulin, and it makes a difference
Yeah.
if you're diabetic. But a lot of, take Prozac, you need many, many thousands of people in order to get one person to respond positively to it. So I guess that kind of reminds me of what you're saying.
Well, let me give you a medical example that would fool no doctor, but fools a lot of people. If you're an ordinarily healthy woman, like any other woman, you go into the doctors and you get diagnosed with breast cancer, what are the chances that you actually have breast cancer? What do you think? What are the odds that, let me ask you this way, what are the odds that you don't have it, even after that positive test?
The odds are significantly higher because that you actually don't have it, because mammograms are so I won't say they're worthless, but they're not as accurate as they're
Right.
touted to be.
If you go into the doctor and you're a healthy woman and you get diagnosed with cancer, the odds that you don't have cancer are actually 95%.
95.
Yeah. Here's why.
But you're scared though.
Here's why that is. The incidence of breast cancer in healthy women is about 0.5%. That's 1 out of every 200 women. But the breast cancer tests, most of them have a false positive rate of about 10%. So if we have 200 women who all go in for getting a test for cancer, okay, one of them has it. She gets tested, and it says she has it. But 20 others don't have it, and because of false positives, they also get told that they have it. So 21 women are told they have breast cancer, but only one does.
Yes.
You see?
Yes.
That's a false positive. Now, understanding that kind of, it seems like legerdemain, math, okay, is you don't have to do the equations to basically to get the idea that testing, there are sorts of guidelines for testing and experimentation that need to be followed in order to, be able to respect the data. Most managers, they don't get it. They really don't get it. Let me give you another example.
Okay,
I'll give you
please,
another example.
please.
A widely published study in the United States found that the overwhelming largest proportion of very, very conservative, politically conservative communities were small towns. So news stories glommed onto this report and tried to speculate why that would be. Why would small towns tend to be so conservative? Well, there's a sense of community. A lot of people in small towns, they're religious. There's all sorts of reasons. Had nothing to do with that. The largest proportion of extremely liberal communities are also small towns. And the answer is that's something that's sometimes euphemistically called the law of small numbers. Small samples tend to have more variation. Imagine you had a whole bunch of towns with only one person in them. Those towns would always be either 100% liberal or 100% conservative, you see? But if you have a town with even 20 people, the chances of being 100% liberal or 100% conservative are very small. And with a town of 1 million people, the larger the town is, the more likely the political sentiments are going to be sort of the way everybody else's political sentiments are. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
That's the law of small numbers. Well, what that means is, to marketing and business, your most extreme cases of customer behavior or customer satisfaction or whatever are going to be among your microsegments, both positive and negative. Your best performing business units and your worst performing business units are very likely to be smaller ones. That's all.
So you've used the word data a couple times,
Yeah.
Big data, small data. I wonder, is part of the problem the inability or maybe the resistance to managers, and I'm thinking of senior managers, some I've had experience with, simply have a resistance to understanding it or an inability to understand it. Now, for example, is it the mathematical skills of these people that's lacking?
But I haven't talked about math. I haven't given you an equation, right? I haven't talked about this. I haven't talked about the standard deviation or the mean versus the median or anything like that. I've done nothing like that. There are certain common sense things that people are going to have to get used to because there's lots of evidence. And you just have to think more clearly. I have a saying, you can lead a man to data, but you can't make him think. Okay?
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that. So you don't think that's the problem, but there is resistance. So what is the source of the resistance?
The source of the resistance is everyone's overconfidence. We all there's something called meta-knowledge. Meta-knowledge isn't what you know; it's what you know about what you know, like metadata. Okay, the data about data. Meta-knowledge is a very, very important aspect of decision making. Knowing what your own limitations are, knowing what you're good at, what you're not good at, knowing what your history is, and so forth. Most managers don't do any regular feedback sessions with themselves. Like of the 15 decisions I made this week, how did they turn out? And which decisions went well? And I play a lot of chess online, and I don't work at it too hard. But when I do want to get better, what I do is I look at some game that I just played and I lost, and I replay it online, and I try to find what move it was that I made that lost me the game. That's feedback. That's the way musicians get better. That's the way academics get better. Chess masters do that, right? Business people don't do that. We just don't do that. We don't go back and revisit decisions. You make a decision, and then people fly on. But the fact is, it's eminently possible to go back and look at decisions and review them and keep a log.
I've said for years, forget studying success, study failure.
Exactly.
There's so much more of it, first of all.
Exactly.
There's so much more to teach you.
You learn a lot more from a failed case study than from a winning case study. It's a lot more instructive.
But not as much fun, I guess, as for
well, it depends on who's looking.
Okay, so we have managers out there who are listening to you. They say, yes, amen, that's right, spot on. Now, what do I have to do to improve? What sort of...
Okay, all right, let me just give you some basic scientific practices. First, make sure your data can be trusted. Okay, trustable data is data that is both accurate and objective. Now, whenever you read a study or see something released, the first question you need to ask yourself is what the Romans used to ask: cui bono? Who benefits from the conclusion that this data, allegedly gives us? You want to assess the objectivity of the data. I think in school, we're in the age of Google. You don't need to know facts and geographies anymore. You can look it up at the touch of a button or pretty soon with the wink of an eye. What we really do need to know, however, is how to think critically about data, how to be skeptical, under what grounds we should be skeptical, how to disbelieve superstitions, and you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
So number one is, what data can you trust? Another important principle is always search for disconfirming data. Search for data. Don't search for data that supports your hypothesis. Search for data that contradicts your hypothesis. That might mean doing something that one socioeconomist called a pre-mortem. You have a big decision to make. All right, you get the group together. You're almost made the decision. You're pretty much agreed to do, and then ask everybody in the room. Okay, let's pretend that we make this decision, and it's now 2 years later, and the policy has failed. Take 5 or 10 minutes and write down a story of why it failed. People believe stories. You can tell yourself a story, and that gives the most knowledgeable people in the room permission to look for alternatives. I'll tell you another possibility to hunt for disconfirming data. You can pay for it. You can pay for
Tell me more.
Warren Buffett, when
Yeah.
he does an acquisition of another company, he frequently hires two bankers. One banker gets a bonus if the deal goes through. One banker gets a bonus if the deal doesn't go through. Mm-hmm. That's
Clever.
pretty smart. You
Clever.
can get rich for no reason. It's pretty smart.
Yes, yes. So okay, but how do you qualify the data? I mean, that's one of the problems that managers have.
Yeah.
How do you know who to trust? How do you know who to believe? A good manager, of which there are some, they don't want to operate in an echo chamber
I agree.
where they're saying. But the thing is, how do you stop that from occurring on your business?
Well, it takes courage and it takes willpower. You have to seek out this confirming data. You have to look for ways in which something you haven't thought of might happen, or reconsider the assumptions you're making. My suggestion is in a business meeting, always ask the juniors for their opinions first, okay? And do a good job of mixing up the participants in a meeting, old and young, experienced, not experienced, tattoos, crew cuts, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
You want a lot of different opinions, but always get the ones who might have the outliers opinions, and get them out first, so that they're not afraid to put their opinion, and that'll allow them to be considered more. Not that it's a democracy, but you want as many different perspectives as possible because you want to consider what you can't predict the future. You can guess at it.
I know the U.S. Supreme Court does that. They have the youngest justice speak first. And President John F. Kennedy in the Bay of Pigs, he did the same thing. He had the youngest, newest people speak first so they would not be unduly influenced by the established older people.
Yes, but the Bay of Pigs is also singled out as a classic example of groupthink.
Groupthink.
Yeah, and groupthink happens when you basically score points by going along with the group. You get political capital or credibility, whatever. You tend to dismiss or, let's say, underestimate the importance of outsiders or other people who don't have access to your skills and knowledge, things like that. And if you want to defeat groupthink, then you have to be active about it. You have to really work on it. And Kennedy, to his credit, tried, but apparently not hard enough.
And
by the way, he learned dramatically with the
Cuban Missile Crisis.
Later.
He did learn, which is characteristic of good management. One of the things you're reminding me of, Don, is Finkelstein's study on why smart executives fail, also known as the 7 Habits of Highly Unsuccessful Managers. His study of corporate failure has found that the senior managers who surrounded themselves with yes people, really, who ruthlessly eliminated dissonant views, they're the ones who are heading for a tumble rapidly.
Yeah. Well, there's a great book by Scott Page called The Difference, and he studied the wisdom of crowds effect that was popularized by James Surowiecki in his book, The Wisdom of Crowds. Basically, where how did the stock market know that it was the frozen O-rings that blew up the Challenger just a few minutes afterwards? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And what he found was that a diverse set of opinions is very useful to the extent that people disagree on what he calls instrumental preferences or how to get something done. Okay, but if they disagree on fundamental premises, which are preferences, which are things like what is the right thing to do, what is the correct direction of success, what do we call success? Okay, if we disagree on the fundamentals of what our business is, what our mission is, that's an unhelpful kind of diversity. Diverse opinions over how to do something, when they're united among people who have a common objective for what the right direction of success is, they can be very, very strong. Toyota has they have a saying in their company. One of their principles is disagree, but disagree respectfully. And their saying is, if two people always agree, one of them is redundant.
Yeah. Yes. Well, very true, huh? Okay, so for our audience out there,
Yeah.
if you had to craft one big final takeaway, what would the chief takeaway be, Don?
I think the chief takeaway would be respect the data. You don't have to believe everything. You shouldn't believe everything, but you should treat data with respect. Evidence. Data is evidence. It's not proof. It's evidence. Treat it like that. That's what I would say.
Respect the data.
Yeah.
Okay. That sounds good. We'll finish it here today. We want to thank you folks for listening to the AmCham Business Podcast. AmCham, taking business to you. And thank you, Don Peppers.
Thanks, Duff.
You've been listening to the Business Podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. This podcast is supported by Lenovo and VML. Lenovo is one of the world's leading personal technology companies, producing innovative PCs and mobile internet devices. Lenovo, for those who do. VML is a full-service digital marketing agency that can take you where you want to go. Everything we are is in everything we do. This is AmCham.